So my name is Samara Jones. I'm one of the coordinators of the Housing First Europe Hub. I'm based in Brussels right now in my daughter's bedroom, working from home. The Housing First Europe Hub is a network that was started almost 5 years ago now by the Y Foundation and FEANSA. And FEANSA is the European Network of Homeless Organizations. And the idea was to bring together actors, all of the actors who were keen and active in trying to scale up Housing First as a means to changing the way we address homelessness in Europe, and really looking at Housing First as a way to make a significant impact on reducing and ending and preventing homelessness. And so our network is comprised of organizations like Y Foundation, which is the leading social housing provider and a leader in Housing First in Finland, as well as organizations, foundations, cities, government ministries, researchers, as well as other organizations working to scale up, deliver and scale up Housing First. So today, this is our second in our series of conversations, our table talk. It's definitely time for a coffee or a tea wherever you are, if it's maybe not exactly a meal time, but so grab yourself a cup of something to drink or a nice cold glass of water. And I'll just introduce very briefly our two speakers or our conversationalists today. Juha Käkinen is the CEO of Y Foundation, the co-founder of the Housing First Europe Hub. He's an avid reader and a creative thinker, and is always somebody who gets us to think more widely and more ambitiously. And he's the driving force behind a lot of what we do, but also particularly this series of really interesting conversations. He's coming to us from summer in Finland today. You can see behind him outside how bright and nice it is out there. And we're also joined by Anand Pandian. Am I saying it correctly? Is it Anand or Anand?
Anand.
Anand. Okay, and I'll just give a very brief introduction for, you would have seen it also on our website. Anand is a professor and department chair in the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And his primary interest is in the problem of environmental ethics and the cultivation of ecological sensibility, the pursuit of livable relations with the natural world. And I think it's also fascinating this idea that this collective that I've been reading about in the last few days around the Ecological Design Collective, which is bringing researchers, designers, activists, and artists together for collaborative projects in ecological imagination and transformation, which sounds really it's a fascinating way to sort of conceptualize how do we apply some of these things that we're thinking about, and how do we actually turn them into art or design or social change. So I will stop here and turn over the conversation to Juha and Anand. I promise I will keep an eye on the chat, so please feel free to raise some questions and some issues if you'd like them to go down a particular path in their conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Samara. And I know that it's pretty cold in Belgium at the moment, but it seems that you are freezing occasionally, so there might be a slight problem with your connection also. It's so good to see you, Anand, online, and glad that you accepted this invitation. As you may know, this discussion series was originally meant to be a pastime for lunch, but time difference makes it more a breakfast for you and a very, very late lunch for us. And actually, a very, very late lunch was a concept which some Finnish restaurants developed when they had to close very early because of the COVID restrictions, and they couldn't provide the supper anymore. So they started to marketing a concept called a very, very late lunch, occasionally also a very long lunch. You have so much interesting ideas and texts that need a wider audience, and a lot of your work, I think, is also very relevant for us working to end homelessness. And I think that we so easily also slip into pessimism and for that reason, it's also so refreshing to read your texts. There's always a hint of hope and openness to new possibilities, a certain positive quality. I think something what Albert Hirschman wrote in A Bias for Hope, widening the limits of what is perceived to be possible. But this article of yours, Staying at Home on Planet Earth, it gives a lot of important perspectives on the concept of home and how it has changed during COVID time. So maybe we open up the discussion with the issues you raise in that article. If I say shortly what's my experience of this COVID time and how the concept of home has changed. So I think that during COVID time, we have seen something very paradoxical. There has been those lucky privileged people who have a home, and some of them have desperately tried to get out, especially during the lockdowns. And those unlucky people who have desperately tried to get in. But in your article, you raise a lot of issues about a more global perspective, or maybe you would like to elaborate a little bit about those themes that you raise in the article.
Thank you so much, Juha. And thank you to Samara and everyone in the Housing First Europe Hub and the Y Foundation for the chance to join you today and to speak with you all. It's always a mystery when you write something where exactly it will go, who might find it, who might read it, who might find it of interest. And we academics, many of us, I think, have the unfortunate habit of writing primarily for each other, writing primarily for ourselves, writing for a smaller circle. And I think the problems that we face, the collective concerns of different kinds that we have to wrestle with, not only as scholars, but honestly as citizens of the world, are such that we need to be having other kinds of conversations. And so when I heard from Housing First and from Juha about the chance to speak with you all, about your having read this op-ed, about the possibility that these small reflections on the idea of home that I had written last year felt relevant somehow to the path breaking and essential work that you've been doing, really in leading not only Europe, but the world in showing that it is in fact possible to begin with the idea of housing as a right and really dedicate oneself to not managing homelessness, but in fact to eradicating it. The idea that these ideas might somehow be of any relevance to people doing such important and path-breaking work is honestly just very humbling and very gratifying. And I'm just very grateful to be in conversation with you all. So thank you so much for the invitation. I think what I would say as a way of contextualizing that particular piece is that this is an op-ed that I wrote in the Indian English language newspaper, The Hindu, in April of 2020. Here in the United States, we were a few weeks into lockdown and the stay-at-home orders that had been imposed in so many different parts of the United States. A draconian lockdown had been imposed quite suddenly and severely in India, not only forcing many people to remain within their homes, but actually stranding ever so many people in spaces beyond their own homes. And the juxtaposition, as Juha just mentioned, between those who are in a sense confined within their homes and those who were essentially prevented from actually reaching their own homes felt like a very powerful and difficult one. But against the backdrop of all of that, there was, I think, the larger questions around home and homelessness, around belonging and the impossibility of belonging that were circulating or beginning to circulate at that time on a larger scale, from an ecological standpoint, from almost a kind of multi-species framework in which it quickly became clear that this particular pandemic, the coronavirus, the COVID pandemic, was itself a symptom or a manifestation of ecologies out of whack, of the displacement of natural beings from their own homes and habitats, of larger relationships or even conditions of homelessness that seem to govern the real conditions of life for so many living creatures around the world, that manifest themselves in pandemics such as this, in sudden efflorescences of epidemic of widespread disease such as this. And all of this was happening, of course, against the backdrop of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day 1970. That is to say, the 50th anniversary of that really influential assertion of the Earth as a planetary home, of the Earth as a whole as the home for a humanity as a whole. And the way in which all of those ideas of home and belonging at a planetary scale that had kicked off the environmental movement of the 1970s were also coming back into focus in 2020. But given this very dark cast, given the global predicament that so many people had found themselves in. So what I was trying to do in that op-ed, something between an essay and an op-ed, I suppose, is to try to make sense of these different layers of home and homelessness, of belonging, finding yourself out of place, indeed, without a home, whether you're a person in need or a different kind of creature. And I was meditating on those questions, and it was springtime. It was April, and it was springtime here, as it was, as it is now, in fact, a little over a year later. And everywhere we went outside, began to see how the creatures that are coming out from their winter hibernation, sort of finding homes of their own in the urban landscape in which we live. And so that effort for me was just a sort of small effort to think between the challenges of asserting a right to home, a right to housing, a right to have yourself a place to stay under conditions as dire as those, as dire as we have them even now, and what we might also think of as a right to habitat for non-human creatures. And the question then of how to think between these questions of home and habitat across that line between the human and the non-human. Those are some of the things that we're
Yeah.
with that particular piece.
I think that we come later back to this ecological aspect, but there are a couple of themes that I would like to explore a little bit further and more related to this question about belonging. I sometimes wonder that as a problem definition, we speak about homelessness, but on the level of providing solutions, we speak about housing, the actual physical place, a flat, maybe some necessary furniture. And then we think about support and services that people may need. But still, I think there's something that seems to lack a missing part, kind of. And I think that it's this sense of belonging that it can't be delivered in the same way as we try to deliver the support services. Of course, we are aware of the emotional aspects that home has for different people, but still, I think that this is the question about this belonging. And then we sometimes, when somebody fails in their housing and can't keep the flat, we are surprised and a little bit disappointed, but we don't always realize that there's this missing part of belonging that we can't provide. And I think that although we speak very nicely about lived experience, our understanding of the life of people experiencing homelessness is still rather superficial. And even in the most developed concepts we have, like the Housing First, our thinking is very individualistic. And we see as the optimal, commonly as normal considered solution is somebody who has experienced homelessness, living now alone in a small, affordable flat. Somehow we think that people get integrated simply when they get a flat somewhere where they never have lived before. And still there seems to loom in the background the voice of an expert who knows better. And I think that this is something where the anthropological perspective, how you engage with people, could give something new for us working in the homelessness sector. We are very much inside the system still, although we try to do things in a different way. So this question of belonging is so important.
Thank you, Juha. The questions of belonging are, at some level, some of the most powerful questions and challenges in the politics of the present. The upsurge of nationalist politics, of a reactionary nationalism, of a reactionary populism, of a xenophobic nationalism in the United States, in India, in so many countries around the world. Of course, in many corners of Europe now too as well, unfortunately. The rise of these movements and this politics certainly has a great deal to do with ideas of belonging, with certain notions of who or where one belongs and who one belongs with. But often these are very abstract ideas. Right? They're abstractions. Nationalism depends on an abstraction of the community to which one belongs, the people with whom one belongs. Benedict Anderson famously described the nation, of course, as an imagined community, the idea of being that there are people that you can't see, that don't share the space with you, that you somehow imagine yourself in some kind of co-presence with. What I hear you speaking of, I say all this by way of giving a certain kind of framing to what you're saying, because I think what you're speaking of is actually very different than that. It's not belonging at the level of a kind of abstract, large scale collective. It's belonging in a much more everyday way. It's belonging in a phenomenological register, if we could use that phrase. It's belonging at the level of lived experience. It's belonging in the context, the milieu of the everyday. And this is, of course, essential, and it's something that we as anthropologists think about a great deal. And it strikes me that when we delve into matters of belonging at that scale, when we resist the temptation to thinking of or taking up belonging simply at the level of meta categories and large scale affinities, but actually look at the lived experience of belonging, then what we find are a host of relationships that make people's lives meaningful. These at times, or often, very often, of course, concern relationships with others, right? Relationships within a household, relationships within families, kin networks. They also, of course, concern relations with neighbors, with those who live side by side with us. We tend to think, for example, of, it's very easy to think of the home as a kind of individual space, as an atomized space. There's a way in which the imagination of even the family in nuclear terms, like that sort of conception of the bourgeois family as an isolate, as a thing in and of itself, also sometimes gives us a very isolating picture of a home on its own, when really social life in many places, especially cities, depends on the everyday relationships one has or would like to have, maybe doesn't always have, with neighbors, that give and take. I've actually been reading a very good book called Good Neighbors by the political theorist Nancy Rosenblum about precisely this phenomenon, about what she calls the democracy of everyday life, and the way in which that democracy of everyday life turns entirely on the kinds of relationships that one can strike up with one's neighbors, and a certain ethos of what she describes as live and let live that ideally governs those relationships. We can think at that level as well in terms of oneself and other neighbors. But as I say all this, I look up and there's a dogwood tree that's in our window, and the sun is coming into my room from that window, and I look up, and there's a little sparrow sitting on one of those branches, and that reminds me too that these relations that we might speak of or think of are also, in fact, relations to place, the relations to inhabited place, the relations to the things of a place. They are relations to the kind of the infrastructure of a place, but also the other living beings that make that place possible and viable. We were speaking about this slightly before we started the formal session today, but these cicadas that are coming out right now in the eastern United States, these are creatures that went underground 17 years ago. We've lived in this house for less than 15. That means that they were here before we got here. And so I think part of the question of belonging and how to address it has to do with the material specificities of an environment, of the kind of built infrastructure, the built space, but also those other dimensions, non-human or otherwise, that also compose that environment. And I would say that one thing, having read a little now about your housing first approach, one thing I'm very impressed by is, I would say, the environmental orientation of the work, the notion that people can't in fact flourish without a domestic environment, that you can't in a sense simply take people in the abstract and expect them to somehow become good people and then you reward them with with a kind of safe home, when in fact everything about who they are and how they are in the world depends on the existence of an environment in which they can flourish. I feel that attention already seems at some level to animate the kind of work that you're doing.
This is important, but what you say about the relationships in daily life, and I have the experience that many homeless people, when they get a home of their own, a hunger for meaningful life grows enormously. There are some funny things. For example, some experts have criticized us in Finland that we have provided these what we call supported housing solutions, where in the same building there are other former homeless people. All your neighbors are former homeless people. Everybody lives in their own flats, and then they have common facilities and also on-site personnel. These have been called congregated and problematic to concentrate homeless people in the same building, but I find it even a little appalling to say that homeless people are the biggest risk to other homeless people. Actually, these buildings have created companionships, shared experiences, real peer support, those meaningful relations that people need in their lives. But I would like to go a little bit further now, because we only have 1 hour, and knowing your work, it's a very short time. And I know also that you have mentioned somewhere that there are other projects that you have been working on lately, and somewhere you mentioned that you are writing something now about the wall of indifference and a fortress like homes. Is there something you could share already with us of the work in progress?
Yeah. So this project, thank you, Juha, and this has something to do with what I'd said a little while ago about reactionary nationalism, reactionary populism. It's something that we have really had to wrestle with here in the United States over the last few years. And it was in 2016, with the rise to power of our former president, that I began to think around this question. And it struck me, I was quite intrigued in particular by the idea of the border wall and the way in which the idea of building that wall seemed to have captured the imagination of so many Americans so readily. In fact, so many Americans who live hundreds, if not thousands of miles even from that border that was of concern. So what is it about the idea of a border wall that was so appealing to so many people? And I began doing ethnographic fieldwork around the United States in 2016. And that's a project that I've been doing really since and working on since. And the conclusion to which I came, having traveled a great deal around the United States, having spoken to hundreds of people about these themes in different parts of the country, most especially people on the conservative side of the political spectrum, the conclusion to which I've come is that an idea like the border wall appeals to people because it, in some ways, echoes and affirms certain patterns of life that they've already become accustomed to on a much more everyday scale. That is to say, the idea of walling off an entire country would only make sense if many people have already come to wall themselves off from others in their daily lives. And one can make this assertion in a variety of different ways. You can think, for example, about the rise of what we might think of as fortress homes in the United States, the individual home as a kind of walled enclave away from others, secured by security cameras, by video doorbells, by all these other kind of security technologies that have become more and more popular, not to mention the fact that so many homes in the United States now lie within gated neighborhoods, not to mention the fact that so much socializing in countries like the United States happens in, say, backyards where you have a kind of restricted form of sociality rather than on front porches and on streetscapes where you might have to interact with people that you don't know. So much of the everyday life of the home has, I think, become restricted both in terms of its commitments to security and in terms of the kinds of relationships that are encouraged and the kinds of relationships that are disencouraged, all of which makes it, I think, much more difficult for people to take seriously the possibility that they can actually have conversations, even relationships with strangers, or even with neighbors. All of these things get much more complicated. That's simply thinking at the level of the home, but you can actually begin to think of this at many other levels as well. The automotive market in the United States is completely dominated now by SUVs and trucks, which I would honestly say, and I think it's not a difficult contention to make, these are also vehicles that are structured like mobile fortresses that are designed to cocoon and shield you from the outside world and to make you oblivious, in fact, to the effect that you have on that world, because they're so much more dangerous for pedestrians and for bicyclists. So you have that at the level of the way that people move through space. You have the ways in which people think about their own bodies and as in solely individual terms, which to me has a great deal to do with the resistance to masking. Masking in pandemic conditions requires an understanding of one's health in interdependent terms that what I do with my own body is so thoroughly wound up with the well-being of others. And I think that many of those who resist that logic do so with an idea, a very individualized idea of the body as a kind of secure thing unto itself in mind. And we can even think about it in terms of the media devices that we use, which are walled off in other ways. We have communities of discourse that have less and less space for oppositional viewpoints. And all of these things, I would say, ramify on each other. And in fact, I think are making it more and more difficult for us to take seriously the circumstances of others unlike ourselves, the viewpoints of others that may be unlike our own, and that ultimately, I would say, amount to a kind of infrastructure of indifference to the well-being of those positioned differently in the world that to me has a great deal to do with the kinds of politics that we find ascendant in countries like the United States.
What you just told, I think that it has also relevance to the fate of migrants, because in the article that we started with, you say something that migrants are caught in an existential impasse. I don't know if we totally realize the scope of things and what is to come. I think it was Dibes Chakrabarty who, in the book Provincializing Europe, which is, by the way, a very nice name for a book, spoke about people being tired to sit in the waiting room of history. So actually, I think that we should maybe think the other way around, not migration and domestic homelessness as separate issues, but think about solving homelessness as part of providing decent living conditions and housing for people who have been forced to migrate.
Mm.
But also, what do you think? Is this shared experience of COVID that kind of thing that creates a more enlightened understanding of our common destiny on this planet Earth? Have we reasons to be optimistic or pessimistic?
There was a piece by Arundhati Roy that was published in the Financial Times, again, early in the pandemic last year, that I think became a source of great inspiration for many activists, movements, writers, researchers all around the world. Echoed constantly. You'd find it everywhere for a while, this piece in which she makes the claim that the pandemic is a portal, the pandemic is an opening. The question of what kind of world we'd find ourselves in as we pass through it, being an open one. She's since written in much more dark terms about where things have wound up in India and elsewhere, and certainly that early moment when we, at least some of us, I think, and I'm sure you folks as well, imagined that this hiatus, this break from the relentless lockstep rhythm of modern life, that productivism that just kind of keeps things going and going and going in a continuous fashion. Stop for a while, take stock. What ought we really to be doing? The skies are bluer, air seems cleaner, everything is quieter because vehicles aren't moving around as much. What kind of life would we like to see? All kinds of ideas were floated at that time, and radical ideas, frankly, about reorganizing the economy, reorganizing society. And I don't know, perhaps most of those didn't ultimately come to pass. Governments, companies, I don't know, powerful actors double down on a continuation of what was being done before. And yet, of course, we've had many experiments that have arisen, that have taken root. People have begun to do things differently. People have begun to live differently. I would say that even in my small neighborhood here in Baltimore, we've had the development of certain kinds of habits and practices that feel very different. A network of mutual aid that developed for people to look after other households in need still continues to operate in various ways between different neighborhoods in my city. You see people outside much more than you did before. People develop new habits with regard to occupying space because they couldn't go into shops and so on in the same way. And perhaps those habits will continue. My city passed through a tremendous kind of racial reckoning on account of some of the events that we saw in this country last year. We've had conversations around race and segregation in many different spaces that I think continue in certain ways, around policing and so on. So I think that there are openings. Even this ecological design collective that Samara had mentioned at the outset is in some ways a consequence of the pandemic. Some of us were thinking around these questions here on our university campus, and everything was shut down, and we began to kind of ask ourselves, well, for whom is all of this work, and can we do it in a manner that would be more open, that would be more invitational for people who can't come and attend a university like this one? Can we begin to build relationships, connections, networks with others elsewhere who have common ideas, and yet not always a kind of framework to share them? So I think that there have been experiments of this kind. I think the Untitled Collective that your Y Foundation is also part of is another really interesting creative sort of hub for experiments of different kinds. But the larger reality may, in fact, be dispiriting, right? I mean, life does go on. The commitment to growth remains, the commitment to economic growth, I mean, and the commitment to a more exclusive picture of well-being at the expense of those who fall on the outside, as you rightly say. All of that continues to have the momentum it has. I think everything turns on the extent to which we can invest these small experiments with the kind of attention and interest and excitement that would really allow them to flourish as seeds of a society to come.
I think that at least it's now much easier to build global networks of like-minded people. That seems to be much easier now with these new ways to communicate. And also, what's certain is that we wash our hands more than we used to do before. So, but in your book, Possible Anthropology, you call these times uneasy times. There are other ways to name the current time we are living. Some call it unnameable times. But I'm very interested of how you see the role of anthropology. What makes it so relevant in these times? What thrills me in a lot of anthropological writing is the curiosity and the future orientation that you have, and the openness to other disciplines, and also the literary quality of the texts. I have to say, sometimes I would say that it's like science fiction in the best possible meaning of both those words. Also, the names, they are so often very poetical, and they tempt you to read Economics of Abandonment, Mushroom at the End of the World, etc. And also, what I find interesting is that many anthropologists are not ashamed to take a political stand when it's needed. And it seems to be needed quite a lot. So how do you see the role of anthropology? What makes it so special at the moment, or so interesting?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. I don't know if it's so special. Honestly, I'm grateful to be an anthropologist, but I'm grateful to be an anthropologist because it affords me the chance to learn from others and from their circumstances, to try to see the world from those other points of view. I think that so many of these impasses about which we're speaking, whether it comes down to that position of the expert and the interventions that ensue from that position that you were speaking of earlier, some of these larger scale political impasses that we've also been talking about, so much of this, I would say, has to do with the difficulty of assuming other points of view. My worry about this infrastructure of indifference, these different technologies, everyday technologies of distantiation, of isolation that we see developing in countries like the United States. My worry about those developments is that they make it much more difficult in a very everyday sense to see the world from someone else's point of view. If I'm accustomed, say, to being inside my house all the time, or just in my backyard, but not in front where I might encounter other people who are not known to me, then I'm not going to be in the practice, in the habit of trying to imagine sharing that space with people that I don't know. So I think at many levels, this challenge of actually experiencing the world from many different points of view is an absolutely fundamental challenge. It has existential stakes in terms of how, not only how we live with others, but our receptivity to the problems that others may face. And I think here, you know, fiction is quite important. Writing is important, whether it's fiction or creative nonfiction, whether it's writing of a more social scientific quality or a more literary quality, any writing that puts you in concretely into the space of experience that someone else inhabits, I think also works in that way of nurturing, cultivating that capacity to see the world anew from another standpoint. And that is the promise of anthropology. That has always been the promise of anthropology, to make that positional movement or interpositional movement possible. We're not always very good at it, frankly. We also get caught up in kind of academic language. We get caught up in the desire to simply sort of impress each other, or to sort of win arguments with each other. But, you know, I think here, as you rightly point out, we actually do have a lot to learn from these affinities between our own writing and literary experiments with those possibilities in other genres. The relationship, for example, between anthropology and science fiction, which you point out, is absolutely essential. In that book, as you know, I think a little with the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, who
Yeah.
spoke of science fiction as a way of getting into the skins of other people. She thought of her work as a writer of science fiction in anthropological terms. I have even described her as a kind of interplanetary ethnographer. As it happens, I'm part of organized a workshop on speculative writing that's happening in just a couple hours as part of this collective. So that is something that I'm quite committed to and interested in. It is up to us to figure out the language with which to make those movements possible. And I think of myself as writing more and more. I think of myself as engaged in the writing of creative nonfiction rather than anthropological scholarship per se.
I was just coming to this, what you wrote about this science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin. There was a very nice quote you have about some fan of hers writing to her that, please keep dreaming alternative worlds, they make the one we are stuck in so much richer. Is this something we should do, or is this something that you aim to do, to imagine a new world, new people to come?
To be honest, I mean, I think sure, but I think that yes, absolutely. But I think the question is who we do that imagining with, who we do that dreaming with, and whether we can't create conditions under which to do that dreaming collaboratively, whether we can't create conditions under which to realize or actualize the dreams that others have. That to me is the radical value of something, you know, as that's the radical value of a housing first commitment, that you actually give people the space in which to dream and you take that need seriously, and everything begins from there, rather than saying, okay, we'll give you the privilege of dreaming once you've demonstrated that you're good enough for us to take your dreams seriously. So
Yeah.
I think that you're already doing it at some level. I think many people are doing it in their own ways. I think activist movements of various kinds around the world are committed to this task of creating the conditions for other forms of collective dreaming. And here I think our role as writers or anthropologists or scholars or what have you isn't to author those dreams, but instead to give them channels, to give them expression, to carry them from one place to another. I see my work as an ethnographer as a work of simply carrying the experience of one world into another. It's the work of a medium or a channel. It's not a question of somehow giving content to those possibilities myself, as much as trying to open up pathways for their realization in other manners.
I may be becoming a little old and soft, but I also think that dreams are so important, because the thing is that if you want to be a pessimistic, there's always good reasons to be pessimistic, because there is this strong grip of the invisible hand of the market and invisible algorithms that more and more guide our behavior. But then I remind myself that algorithms don't dream. There is still surviving this tiny corner of real people in vulnerability, in constantly changing joy and sorrow with dreams and aspirations. And it is there that the change can come from our dreams. But the question is, as you said, that with whom are we dreaming and with whom are we making these dreams concrete? So we need like-minded people and come together, and that's the way to change the world.
And so much of it does seem to turn on authorizing discourses, on the extent to which we're committed to the value of certain utterances as opposed to other utterances, certain commitments as opposed to other commitments, certain voices as opposed to other voices. And I think, in my mind, anthropology is good anthropology when it's willing to put those other voices side by side with the voices of a more expert knower as embodiments of equally plausible ways of being in the world.
Just as I thought before, that an hour will be a very short time for the discussion, so we still have a few minutes, and I don't know, Samara, if there are any questions, but unless, then we will start providing the necessary book recommendations. That
I haven't seen a lot of questions coming in, but I mean, I think it's the discussion is fascinating, because I think, you know, one of the reasons we also, or Juha, kicked off this series is also the people participating and who will listen to this afterwards. We or all of us, we all get so focused in what we do in our day-to-day lives, and it's hard, or it's not as easy to make time to think in broader ways and to connect with different ways of thinking. And so I don't know, I've just really enjoyed having this sort of opportunity to go and use my brain in a different way than I do on a daily basis. And I think it's really opening up ideas and thoughts and helping me to be more optimistic, because I think it is easy to become pessimistic, easy to become cynical, and hard to see, certainly in the work that we do. When we are trying to do things better, we also see where things are not working. And so to be fixated a bit on the problems too much, rather than on, indeed, there is something radical about Housing First. And it is so much, like you've both said, about giving everybody that same right. It's a very rights-based approach, that everyone has that right to be safe and secure and themselves in their own home. So from there, they can build their lives and they can make those connections, because those connections and that sense of belonging, we all need that. And we need that, even as I think, especially as we come, partway out of this COVID period, where some people have been very lucky and done well in lockdown and in the connections with the family that they've maybe been locked down with. But for many other people, it's been a very severe rupture in their connections and in their sense of belonging, and a displacement, even if they've been in their home. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that hopefully will come out of reconnecting with people. And I mean, like you both alluded to, just this very idea that we can network, that reach, and that you can come together in this, putting aside the linguistic issues for the moment, but having a forum like this means that so many more people can reach and talk to each other than we would have previously if we'd had to arrange a conference and fly people in and travel and so on. And as much as I miss seeing people and visiting, places, I think it's been quite democratizing to use these technologies. The language issue still for our network is such a big one because we speak, English is the lingua franca, unfortunately, for a lot of these discussions. So that's one that's a stumbling block for us to keep working at chipping away at. But anyways, I've come to lots of interesting pathways for thinking today, for sure. And I, like Juha said, I think it would be we did this at the end of our last one. We would like to ask both of you, and I've noted down a couple as well of a couple of book suggestions for everybody who's listening. And we started a group on Goodreads, so we can put them there, and definitely on our website. So maybe we'll start again with you. Do you have some reading suggestions that you would like to pass on?
Well, there's one very recent book by Susan Buck-Morss called Year One, a philosophical recounting, which is a fascinating retelling of the first century, combining philosophy and history. And then more fiction or biography style is a book by Maria Stepanova, contemporary Russian writer. In Memory of Memories, the book. And the third one that I have to mention is by my favorite poet, a Danish poet, Pia Tafdrup. It's an English translation, The Taste of Steel and the Smell of Snow. I tried to read it in Danish, but now I have the opportunity to see what I missed in my exercise of complicated Danish language. So these books are certainly worth reading.
Anand, do you have something?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. There's a few that come to mind. And so here are 4 books in 4 genres. I mentioned this work that I've been doing on the United States and on this phenomenon of sort of walling oneself in and walling the world out and how to make sense of that. There's an architectural historian named Andrea Vesentini who's written a brilliant book, a kind of cultural history of this phenomenon called Indoor America, which is about the construction of the bourgeois environment as a space of refuge, as a space of isolation, as an emergent form of sealing oneself off from the world. It is such an interesting and important book. And he thinks not only about the suburban home, about the layout of cities, but also even about the automobile as a moving instantiation of the same kind of commitment to retreat. So I think anyone interested in engaging with home in a more relational and socially committed fashion, I think has to wrestle with the legacies that are outlined in a book like that. Another book that I've read recently that in some ways you might take as a kind of counterpoint to that and as a way of beginning to kind of think beyond that bubble that he puts the kind of quintessentially American suburban household in is actually a memoir by the writer Margaret Renkl, which some of you all might know. It was published last year. I believe it was called Late Migrations. And it's a series of meditations on life and death that interweave the certain events of sort of growing up and events in her family with observations that she makes as a naturalist in the context of the home and the space beyond it, and really just ways of weaving together in a really poignant and powerful manner the affective life of the people of a family and the vicissitudes of life and death that catch up all the other creatures that their lives are interwoven with, that you wouldn't necessarily even notice unless you were paying attention as a naturalist. A third book in terms of that matter of relationships or an interrelationality when it comes to the experience of home and belonging is the anthropological book that I would recommend. And it's not a very recent anthropology, but it's the one that comes to mind as is really powerful and challenging and really moving in terms of ethnography. It's a book by the American anthropologist Margaret Trawick called Notes on Love in a Tamil Family. It was written, I believe, in the late 1980s, if I remember correctly, and it's based on her observations of the domestic life of a family that she became part of in South India. And it's all about a kind of relational personhood. It's about everything takes place inside and outside the home, but it's all animated by a deeply relational picture of the self, a picture of the individual sort of being and well-being is completely bound up with the lives of the others that they are living with and alongside. It's one of the most textured accounts of that kind, and I think it could be of interest to folks in your network, precisely because I think at some level, this question of a deeper and more constitutive relationality seems to be really important to kind of work that you're doing. And the last thing in the register of speculative fiction that I think has a great deal, we have a great deal to learn from the textures of these two books. It would be the parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, the African-American speculative fiction, science fiction writer. Books set actually in the 2020s, but in a dystopian 2020s, in a dystopian decade of the 2020s that sort of began with a fantasy, with a family that lives in a walled compound, but the walls fall and they have to kind of find their way in the world. And it is a very dark world. It is a pre-Trumpian world. The candidate that rises to power in those books rises to power with the slogan "Make America Great Again." And eventually, there's the creation of a kind of intentional community in the rural recesses of Northern California. And ultimately, there's a kind of cosmic vision that animates the organizing of this, the protagonist of these two books, whose name is Lauren Olamina, who really sees this movement, Earthseed, as a movement of sort of finding one's home in the stars. And so the trajectory of belonging sort of begins with the fantasy, the impossible fantasy of a walled compound, and ultimately sort of arrives at a picture of a much more encompassing and almost cosmic belonging. And there's a lot to think with in those two books as well.
Wow, those are fantastic additions to our reading list. I had one. It touches on more on migration, and it's quite poignant right now. It's called The House of Glass, and it's a memoir by a journalist, Hadley Freeman, and about her grandmother who escaped the Nazis and came to the US, but left her family, her Polish family, behind in Paris. So it's also about the person who survived in one place but never felt so much at home in her adopted home that she was sort of forced to adopt, versus the home that she had to abandon, but it was a new home, having been driven out of Poland, and all of those interfamily and intergenerational connections about what we know, what we tell ourselves about our family's history. And also, I found it very interesting as a Canadian reading about it in Europe, understanding the impact of the occupation and the Nazis in France, which is not something I knew very much about, even though I live next door. So I found it was a really interesting sort of diving in at a personal level, but bringing these very still current issues around anti-Semitism and migration and acceptance and belonging. And it was incredibly well written. So I would add that one to the list. And I think we have to close the conversation. I think we've gone a bit beyond our time, I'm afraid. But I would very much like to thank you, Anand, for your time, and to Juha as well for giving us an opportunity to participate in this very stimulating conversation. And hopefully this is one of many, and that we can continue to work together and find some common ground on which we can build some projects and some future collaboration. So thank you very much, both of you, for today's session.
Thank you.
And to
Thank
Claire
you,
for the
Anand.
Oh,
Anand, it was a pleasure, and let's keep on dreaming and sharing our dreams in the future also.
I love it. I would love to figure out ways to continue to think and to think together, and maybe to begin to work together in some small fashion. Yeah, it's what you all are doing is inspiring, and it's essential, and really hope that it catches some momentum here in the United States, where we wrestle with these problems in such a I don't know, poor manner. Honestly, we have a lot to learn from the kind of work that you're doing. So thank you so much for it, and thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
speak with
Thank
you.
you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll keep you posted on our next event. Thank you again. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.